Welcome back to Multifamily Talks. I'm Krista Hurley, Industry Principal at RealPage, and your host for today's episode. Multifamily Talks Live is a monthly video series on LinkedIn where we discuss all things multifamily through candid conversations. And if you can't join us live, you can watch or listen to any replays on LinkedIn or your favorite podcast platform. Be sure to follow us so you don't miss future episodes, and remember to drop any questions that you may have in the comments section. Today's conversation touches on something that impacts nearly every renter and operator in multifamily: security deposits and the growing shift towards deposit alternatives. Across the industry, operators are balancing affordability pressures, evolving legislation, operational complexity, and resident expectations around flexibility and transparency. And at the same time, more providers are entering the market with alternatives designed to reduce moving costs while helping owners better manage risk and compliance. So today we're bringing together industry expert Lisa Gedmin to break down the current landscape of deposit alternatives. Hi, Lisa. Welcome.
Hi,
Tell our
Krista.
audience a little about yourself.
Sure. So I've been part of the RealPage family for about 7.5 years. I was part of an acquisition, but I've been in the deposit alternative space since about 2008. So I'm kind of a veteran, and I've watched the evolution of deposit alternatives over the years. And so we've got a lot of exciting things happening now.
Can't wait for this conversation. So to kick us off, let's start at a high level. Security deposits have been a part of multifamily operations forever. So why is this conversation accelerating now? Like, what's changed over the last few years that pushed deposit alternatives back into the spotlight?
So I think you have to think about how cyclical property management is in general, right? So the ebbs and flows of the business right now, typically if there's an economic downturn or markets get soft or there's a lot of new product on board, then you see concessions, and you see the first line of defense before concessions is to reduce your deposit,
Right.
to try to increase leasing velocity. So deposit alternatives play a role in that, in the way that they can be very cost effective for the residents, but not expose your properties to additional risk.
Yeah. So before we compare products, I think it would be very helpful to level set on terminology, because some operators hear a lot of phrases thrown around interchangeably. So when we say deposit alternatives, what are the major models currently in market, and how do they fundamentally differ from one another?
I think that's a really good question, because a deposit alternative is exactly that. It is supposed to replace or be an option as opposed to a deposit. There are payment options that you can break your deposit into payments. That's really more of a financial model. There are also, escrow managers that will manage deposits. And then there are guarantors. That's a brand, but there's also those guaranteed type products that are really made for your low accept type residents that need some additional support, or, in lieu of a cosigner. So those are the different products types, but we're going to speak specifically about deposit alternatives today.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It is a lot.
There's a lot out there.
It is. There's a lot.
So one thing that I do hear often from operators is that these programs may sound similar on paper, but operationally they behave very differently. So for teams managing multiple communities or portfolios, what are the biggest differences that you see between these offerings?
So I think if you look at traditional security deposits, you have to look at the fact that escrow is always a negative on your P&L spreadsheet, right? So managing escrow is expensive. When you have to refund a deposit, there's a cost associated with refunding a deposit. And then you have deposit alternatives like pooled solutions. And those are the type of solutions that's kind of like self-insurance. You're going to charge a one-time non-refundable fee. You build those pools up, and you use that to offset any bad debt you get from your residents. Those models were the first entry level into deposit alternatives, and they've been around for a very long time. About the past 7 years, you've seen the evolution of deposit insurance. So it's actual insurance. It's underwritten by a carrier. There's policies in place to protect the community against anything that the resident may do when they move out and when they leave for those types of expenses. And now we have an emerging, more of a pre-authorization. Think of like when you go to a hotel and they do a pre-authorization on your credit card for your stay. Same type of business model, but they're using Plaid technology. So they're pinging the bank or a credit card to make sure there's available funds for a full deposit. And so those technologies also are emerging now, and there's a few players in that space. And then lastly, there's escrow managers. So there are companies out there specifically designed to manage your escrow for you. So they're going to make sure you're compliant in whatever jurisdiction your community is in. They're going to make sure that they refund the deposit within the times based on your lease agreement. Some are 30 days, some 60 days. Depending on when you move out, you have to refund that deposit, and they're going to handle the transaction. So that's what's out there right now.
Yeah, then that's a lot. I keep saying that. That's
very saturated.
It is
very saturated.
Yes. So resident communication feels like one of the most important pieces of this conversation, especially that's so closely tied to my world. How do residents typically react when they're offered a deposit alternative instead of a traditional security deposit? And what messaging works best to avoid confusion or mistrust?
So I think that the deposit alternatives really are offering the resident a low-cost move-in option. That is the benefit to the resident, right? They're going to pay a small premium or a small non-refundable fee at some point in the transaction in lieu of a full deposit. And let's just say it's 1 month's rent, right? So that process, the benefit to them is the low-cost move-in option. I think where it gets a little convoluted for the resident is they feel like, okay, well, I paid this one-time small premium. Now I have this protection for myself. It is not protection for the resident. It's protection for the unit. The resident, in a lot of cases, is still financially responsible for any bad debt they leave when they move out.
Right.
There can be credit implications if they move out. There's a collection process if they move out, and with the exception of deposit insurance, because that is a premium they're paying for a policy. But the other models are designed where you're basically getting a low-cost move-in. That's what you're getting as a resident. And so the transparency usually is once they apply or they choose that option, they're going to sign some type of an addendum, some kind of agreement that kind of provides that transparency that, hey, you're getting this great move-in cost. You're still responsible for all the terms and conditions of your lease.
So I'm going to throw you a curveball because I'm just interested. Do they have a choice?
Yes.
As the operator, you say this is your choice.
Yes.
And they can pick that based on their needs.
And there's a lot of legislation now coming. There's a lot of things happening in multifamily right now, but specifically in some jurisdictions, you have to offer an option or you have to offer flexible payments of that deposit. So this aligns very well with it. So it's an either or. You can either pay the full deposit or you can take this low cost option, understanding the fact that you're still responsible for the terms and conditions of your lease.
Yeah, I would definitely want a choice myself. So
yes, me too.
I love that. I love that we offer that. So what is the measurable impact on leasing performance, if any, that our operators should expect?
So think about when someone's coming to move in, just the upfront cost involved in making that move, right? If you're on the coast, average deposit is 1 month's rent, right? So if you're moving into a 2,000 unit community, you have to have your deposit, which is $2,000. You have to have your first month's rent, which is $2,000,
right,
and all of your utilities. So we see an increase in leasing velocity of about 85%. So when you're using a deposit alternative, what might stay on the market for 2 weeks, right? I'm going to move in 2 weeks because in my head, I'm thinking I need one more paycheck to fund that account. So now we're going to reduce that. It's really like a reduction in vacancy loss.
Right.
We're going to increase that leasing velocity, reduce that vacancy loss because you have a low cost option.
I love that. I love that for the leasing side of the world. Again, another part of my world that
absolutely
aligns. So let's shift into the operational side, because this is where I think things can get complicated for at least me. So maybe I'm going to be asking a lot of clarifying questions. But from your perspective, working in this space, what has traditionally been some of the biggest administrative and compliance pain points operators face when managing security deposits?
So managing the security deposit is a liability on your books, right? So depending on the state that you're operating in, you can have to, if I take a $2,000 deposit, I'm responsible for providing interest on that deposit for the length of the lease, right? So there's an accounting burden that's pretty significant in being able to make sure that you're refunding the right amount. There's also a predetermined, kind of a preconceived notion by the resident sometimes is that I'm going to pay this deposit and they're going to keep it. Right? And that's not a true statement. Most operators are upfront. They're only going to charge whatever you owe when you move out. If you leave your apartment clean, you fulfill your lease, you're going to get your deposit refunded.
Right.
Now, there are also responsibilities from an owner to refund that within a certain timeline. So depending on the state, it could be 30 days, 60 days. If they don't provide you a moving forwarding address, sometimes you're sending it to whatever the last known address is. It's coming back. The resident's calling 60 days later. I never got my deposit. Now you're reissuing another check, canceling another check. So fundamentally, there are some issues just with managing escrow. It's time consuming and it's expensive.
Yeah.
So the deposit alternatives, when you are utilizing them, about 75% of your residents will choose the option because it is cost effective. But what that does is pull you out of that refund situation. Right? Because at the end of the lease, depending on the model, they're not going to be refunded anything, right? They're either paying for a policy, they're being put in a pool, or they've had a pre-authorization and there's nothing going to be charged to them, so there's nothing to refund.
Yeah.
So it streamlines that process. I will say that when you're moving towards a deposit alternative, sometimes there's a fear of the change management. Well, we've done deposits 100 years. We've required this deposit for however long.
Right.
And it's really, it comes down to your implementation and how you articulate to the teams and the training you provide those teams. So those are the things that I see operationally that can sometimes be the hurdles.
Another curveball, because it's not in our questions that we went through in rehearsal, but how adopted is this deposit alternatives? Do you know?
So I would say on average, about 75% of the residents will choose that option.
Wow.
And it also depends on the class, the asset class.
Right.
Right. So A product probably has a little bit less adoption than B or, workforce housing type. That's going to get probably a higher adoption. But on average, I would say 75% will choose that option. And one other thing I used to like to say is that because I've sold deposit alternatives for a long time, right? We may have the exact same credit score, right? Say we have a 750 credit score.
Love us,
right? We're the ones, right? So we're moving in. I'm going to choose the deposit alternative. And the reason why is because I want to use the rest of that money to decorate my apartment. Right. Or whereas you may want to take the rest of that money and invest it. Right. So cash is king. I'm going to hold on to as much cash as I can. So for me, it's the smarter choice to pay the one-time non-refundable fee or the premium because I want to keep my cash.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm thinking as a renter, that when I used to rent almost 20 years ago, when you would have a security deposit, you waited for that security deposit to find another apartment to put that down on that next apartment. And that was just how you did it when you were moving around a lot. Now, are these renters seeking properties that offer a deposit alternative?
I would say that it makes it more attractive. I don't know that they actively search by who's offering such and such deposit alternative. However, when you're partnered with someone that's promoting a deposit alternative, there are ways that they can search, right? They can go by zip code and see what's available in their space if they're using a certain provider that they've had a good experience with.
Yeah.
So it can be it can somewhat be a marketing tool.
So let's shift a little bit to the technology perspective. So what integrations are considered non-negotiable when evaluating a deposit alternative provider?
So the first, it's not necessarily an integration, but the qualification is that you've got to be offering a full deposit. So it can't be a market-driven deposit. You can't put a deposit alternative against $100 security deposit. It's just not it's not going to create
mathing.
The math doesn't math. There's not enough of a variance to choose that option, right? From a technology standpoint, you want someone integrated within your PMS system because you want visibility on the resident ledger that they have a deposit alternative, that they have zero deposit in place. Those are the things that you're looking for as far as partnering with someone for that. So having someone that's integrated within your PMS system is going to make your life so much easier. And also, old school, right? 2008. Back in the day, that resident would bring in a money order or a check, and that check would be held by the office. The office would then submit those checks to the provider, and the coverage would be placed, right? So now it's fully embedded sometimes into the workflow. They have the option of paying their deposit online. They have the option of enrolling in a deposit alternative. There's no paper transaction. There's no opportunity for fraud, all the other things that can happen when you're in a manual process situation. So I would say, depending on your PMS system, you want something that can integrate into your workflow now and also be part of your leasing workflow.
Right, exactly. So you mentioned this earlier, the legal and regulatory landscape around deposits seem to be evolving almost monthly right now. So what are the biggest compliance trends operators should be paying attention to today?
So because I'm a licensed insurance person, I am constantly kind of scouring what's going on in landscapes. It's usually the coasts that are most restrictive and that have and for good reason, right? They're looking to protect the resident to make sure that they have a good experience and they're getting a fair treatment. But in the same sense, you really need to pay attention anytime you're offering a deposit alternative. Is it applicable in your state? How does it work? Most professional providers of these types of services know exactly what is available and not available. What is the max deposit you can charge against the deposit alternative? Whether the deposit alternative qualifies for that alternate option that you are required to give. So all of those things with a professional provider can help address his questions and get you in a good place.
Yeah, because I wouldn't even know where to start with that. So one issue I think that operators worry about is ensuring these products remain truly optional and transparently communicated. So what disclosures or resident acknowledgments do you consider absolutely critical to mitigate the legal and reputational risk that they may pose?
So I think it goes back to having some processes integrated into your workflow, right? So at that point, it's offered as an option, right? So they have the choice of paying a $2,000 deposit or enrolling in an alternative that will provide that coverage or policy in the same equitable amount of $2,000, right? So that ensures, one, that it's an option, right? And then working with a partner that understands the dynamics of how it should be offered, there are always going to be some type of, it's usually an addendum or some type of alternative lease language that's going to state you have the option of this or the option of that. They choose.
Yeah.
Right.
Reading that fine print or having somebody that knows what the fine print says.
And making sure the fine print is not fine.
Yeah. Not fine.
You don't need the tiny little language, at the bottom of it. So that is what's really important.
Yeah. So let's talk financial outcomes because ultimately operators are evaluating whether these programs improve performance while reducing risk. So how does loss rates and recovery outcomes compare here?
So you have to think about a traditional deposit. So if I take a $2,000 deposit and 10%, 90% of my residents are getting refunds, there's not there's a lot of burden in refunding those deposits, but essentially I'm getting, that 10% of residents that I have to liquidate their deposits. These types of solutions are not profit centers, right? They are designed to mitigate bad debt. And what we find is over a market-driven deposit, a $200 or $300 deposit that you're running as a special or a $99 move-in, 200% lift in the collectability and the amount of bad debt reduction.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're able to more effectively mitigate that bad debt when a resident does leave owing.
Yeah. Wow.
And consistently.
Yeah. Yeah. And looking ahead over the next 3 to 5 years, where do you see this space heading? Are we moving toward a world where traditional cash deposits become the exception rather than the norm? Or do you think they'll continue to remain a core option in professionally managed multifamily assets?
So I think they're going to always be an option, but I do see an evolution of a hybrid. I would see what I think is going to happen in this space, especially maybe in the next 18 to 24 months, is you're going to see a deposit alternative and an escrow manager partnered. So whether they choose the escrow, paying a full deposit, you're going to have an escrow manager, and they're one and the same, right? So a company that can offer both products. So if they choose the deposit option, then they're going to refund. They're going to make sure that it's compliant in the state that you're competing in. They're going to assess the interest, whatever needs to happen for that, while offering the alternative and running that program simultaneously. So I would say you're going to see a hybrid. Of those evolving.
18 to 24 months. I like that. Timelines are always crucial.
Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, I got my crystal ball. I'm saying 18 to 24 months, but
I like it. So before we wrap, I'd love to leave our audience with practical takeaways. And so for operators who haven't yet adopted a deposit alternative strategy, what are the first 3 things that they should evaluate after today's conversation?
So you really need to understand what your bad debt is. And also what is especially if you're a large fee operator, you might have multiple deposit strategies going on, right? So what is your strategy? Who makes those decisions? Is it made regionally? Is it made on the fly by a manager that says, hey, I got to get to 90% occupancy by the end of this month, or waiving deposits right now? one, we want the consistency, right? Especially with the, fair housing and all of the things, being consistent and making sure that you have a solid plan in place. Let us manage that, right? As professionals that do this for a living, you want someone to manage that program for you. So I would say first, what is your bad debt? And how are we going to chip away? How can we make that more effective? To what is your current deposit strategy and how can we improve upon that by adding a deposit alternative? And lastly, let's get you out of escrow because it really is time consuming and financially burdensome on your teams.
Yeah. Awesome. Love those nuggets. And finally, what would you leave the audience with in terms of one metric that owners should consistently monitor to determine whether their deposit strategy, traditional or alternative, is actually working?
So I would say when you're professionally partnered with someone that's offering your deposit alternative, you usually do about a 6-month check-in. And the great thing about a deposit alternative is it's not set in stone, right? So if your situation is where, oh my gosh, I'm really in a tough leasing situation. I have a new high rise that's coming up. They're going to run all kinds of specials and I need to make sure that we can tweak the program at any given time based on market conditions. Or if you find that you have a community that's really struggling with bad debt, all of a sudden you have a lot of evictions or skips or those types of things happening, then we can tweak the program to be designed to be more of a risk mitigation solution. So it is, again, partnering with someone and communicating, right? So you don't want deposits alternatives were never designed to be set it and forget it. They were supposed to adapt with emerging marketing conditions, right? So when times get better, right, the market starts improving, let's bump up your deposits. Let's make sure that we have a good solid plan in place, right? And also that the premium or the payment that's being paid is sufficient to keep that leasing velocity that you need.
Perfect. Great ending. So we've covered a lot today, from resident affordability and operational efficiency to compliance, risk management, and the future of leasing flexibility in multifamily. One thing that became very clear to me throughout this conversation is that deposit strategies are no longer just a financial or operational decision. They directly impact the resident experience, leasing conversions, transparency, and long-term trust between operators and residents. Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today. I had so much fun with you. And before we go, don't forget that Real World 2026 is happening this August at the Gaylord Rockies Resort and Convention Center in Denver, Colorado. If conversations like today's are important to your business, Real World is where multifamily leaders come together to explore the future of operations, technology, and resident experience firsthand. Go to realworld.realpage.com to register today. We hope that everyone enjoyed today's deep dive into deposit alternatives, compliance, and the evolving resident experience. Thanks so much, everybody, and we'll see you in June for our next Multifamily Talks Live.